In the smoky heart of Victorian London, amid the rattling of horse-drawn carriages and the cries of street vendors, a child was born who would one day transform the language of cinema forever. On April 16, 1889, Charles Spencer Chaplin came into the world in a small house on East Street, Walworth. To the neighbors and the city at large, he was just another poor boy among thousands, one destined perhaps for the workhouse or the factories. But fate had other plans. Charlie's parents, Charles Chaplin Sr. and Hannah Harriet Hill, were both performers in the vibrant but unforgiving world of London's music halls. His father, a singer with a booming voice, was known for ballads that filled smoky taverns and theatres. His mother, whom Charlie affectionately called Lily Harley on stage, was a light soprano with a delicate charm. For a short while, life may have seemed promising. The Chaplins weren't wealthy, but they lived with the possibility of applause and pay. Yet behind the curtains, the family was unraveling. Charlie's father struggled with alcoholism, a disease that would take him away both emotionally and physically. His absences grew longer, his drinking heavier, and the family's income dwindled until there was little more than scraps to live on. His mother, Hannah, tried to keep the household afloat, singing wherever she could, sewing clothes to earn a few pennies, and taking in washing. But the pressure was immense. By the time Charlie was a toddler, the Chaplin household was defined not by music but by silence and hunger. In his later years, Chaplin would recall memories of gnawing poverty, the sound of his stomach growling at night, the shame of worn-out shoes, the embarrassment of being the poorest boy on the street. Poverty was not unusual in London at the time. The city teemed with beggars, orphans, and struggling families. Yet for Charlie, this deprivation left a mark that would never fade. It would later shape the tenderness and resilience of his greatest film character, the Tramp. When Charlie was around 5 years old, something remarkable happened. His mother, Hannah, was performing at a theatre when her voice suddenly cracked and failed. The audience, impatient and unforgiving, began to jeer. In desperation, the stage manager pushed little Charlie forward to entertain them. The boy, barely old enough to understand the weight of the moment, sang a song with such charm and innocence that the crowd roared with laughter and applause. Coins rained onto the stage. It was his first taste of performance, and he never forgot it. The thrill of connecting with an audience, of making strangers smile, planted a seed in his young heart. Perhaps life would always be hard, but maybe, just maybe, he could survive through the magic of performance. As his father disappeared into alcoholism, and his mother's mental health began to fail, the Chaplin children, Charlie and his older half-brother Sidney, were thrust into a harsher reality. They were sent to the workhouse, a bleak institution meant to house the destitute. Life in the workhouse was not life at all. Children were separated from their parents, made to wear coarse uniforms, and fed meager rations of porridge or bread. Discipline was strict, and joy was scarce. For Charlie, it was a world of grey walls and grey futures. Yet even in such a place, his imagination became his salvation. He mimicked the wardens, imitated the swagger of other boys, and found ways to bring laughter into the bleak halls. The workhouse was a constant reminder of how far his family had fallen. But instead of crushing him, it gave him an instinct to observe, to study human behavior, and to find humor in tragedy, a skill that would define his artistry decades later. Perhaps the greatest influence on Charlie during these years was his mother, Hannah. Despite her struggles, she remained a figure of love and tenderness. She encouraged Charlie to use his imagination, to see the world not just as it was but as it could be. Yet her own health was failing. Hannah suffered from bouts of mental illness, likely worsened by poverty and malnutrition. At times she would drift into strange moods, speaking to unseen figures or falling into deep silences. Eventually, she was committed to Cane Hill Asylum, leaving her boys to fend for themselves. For a child, this was a devastating loss. Charlie adored his mother, and the thought of her locked away haunted him throughout his life. Sidney, being older, tried to take responsibility. He worked odd jobs, cared for Charlie, and tried to shield him from the worst of their hardships. The bond between the brothers grew strong, a partnership that would last throughout their careers. In the absence of stability, Charlie became a keen observer of the world around him. The streets of London were alive with characters: ragged beggars, pompous policemen, drunken men stumbling out of taverns, street musicians trying to earn pennies, and wealthy gentlemen striding past with disdain. Charlie absorbed it all. Every gesture, every stumble, every smile. He learned that humor often lived side by side with pain, that the drunkard falling into a puddle might be funny, but beneath it was sadness. He saw the resilience of ordinary people, and he tucked these images into his memory. Years later, when he crafted the Tramp, it was these early memories that gave the character such authenticity. Despite his hardships, Charlie was determined not to be crushed. He worked wherever he could, running errands, selling newspapers, and occasionally performing. He had no formal education beyond what little schooling he could snatch between workhouse days, but he had curiosity and drive. By his early teens, Charlie began finding work on stage, often through connections made by Sydney. The theatre world was competitive and ruthless, but for Charlie, it was a lifeline. Performing gave him not only income but identity. He was no longer just another poor boy. He was a performer, a storyteller, a maker of laughter. Looking back, it's astonishing how much of Chaplin's future genius was born in these years of struggle. His sensitivity to human suffering, his ability to find humor in pain, his gift for observing people, and his drive to survive through performance, all these qualities were forged in the fires of his difficult childhood. In a world that often dismissed the poor as invisible, Charlie learned how to make himself seen and heard. He discovered that laughter could be a weapon against despair, and that performance could turn pain into art. By the time he was entering his teenage years, the path ahead was still uncertain. But one thing was clear: Charlie Chaplin was destined to rise above his circumstances. He had already survived more than most men ever would, and he carried with him the resilience of the streets, the tenderness of his mother's love, and the determination of a boy who had learned to turn shadows into light. The world did not know it yet, but from these early struggles, a genius was being shaped, one who would go on to make millions laugh, cry, and think. By the time Charlie Chaplin entered his teenage years, the shadow of poverty still loomed, but flickers of light began to shine through. The bleakness of the workhouse and the instability of his childhood had left scars, but they had also given him resilience, an inner steel that kept him pressing forward. If his childhood had been a lesson in survival, his teenage years became a lesson in discovery. This was the period when Charlie first began to realize his destiny, not through classrooms or textbooks, but through the stage. Charlie's earliest performances were small and uncertain. With his half-brother Sydney working steadily in theatre troupes, the younger Chaplin began to find opportunities as well. His boyish charm, expressive face, and natural sense of timing made him a favorite for juvenile roles. At age 14, Charlie secured a role in a play based on Sherlock Holmes. He played the part of Billy, the page boy. Though it was a minor role, Charlie threw himself into it with seriousness and dedication. He studied every gesture, every pause, every line. On stage, he came alive. He wasn't the poor boy from Kennington anymore. He was someone else, someone important. Audiences noticed. Even in small parts, Charlie had a way of drawing attention without stealing focus. His subtle expressions, wide eyes, a tilt of the head, a sly grin, were often enough to earn chuckles or applause. For a boy with little formal education, this was his classroom. The stage became the place where he studied human behavior, honed his instincts, and learned the art of storytelling without words. The turning point came when Charlie joined Fred Carnot's vaudeville troupe, one of the most respected comedy companies in England. Carnot was a master of pantomime and slapstick, and his troupe performed comedy sketches in theatres across Britain and beyond. For Charlie, this was like entering a new world. Carnot's troupe demanded discipline, precision, and creativity. Every movement had to be exaggerated enough for the audience in the back row to see, yet controlled enough to avoid chaos. Timing was everything. One mistimed pratfall could ruin a gag. Charlie quickly proved himself. His agility, rubbery expressions, and instinctive feel for comedy made him stand out. He could turn a simple gesture, like tripping over a chair, into a work of art. Audiences loved his blend of innocence and mischief. He wasn't just funny, he was endearing. Life with the troupe also meant travel. For the first time, Charlie began to see the world beyond London's grim streets. The troupe toured across Britain, performing to packed houses. The thrill of applause, the laughter of strangers, and the camaraderie of fellow performers filled him with purpose. Throughout this time, Charlie's relationship with his older brother Sydney remained central. Sydney had always been the caretaker, the one who shouldered responsibility when their mother was ill. Now, he was also Charlie's partner in ambition. Sydney was already establishing himself as a capable performer, and his success opened doors for Charlie. The brothers encouraged one another, sharing dreams and frustrations, navigating the challenges of theatre life together. In many ways, Sydney became both brother and father figure to Charlie, grounding him while also pushing him forward. What set Charlie apart during his Carnot years was his dedication to pantomime, the art of storytelling without words. In an age before television and sound films, audiences relied on exaggerated gestures and expressions to understand the humor. Charlie studied people obsessively. He mimicked the swagger of soldiers, the nervous twitch of a shy man, the pomp of authority figures, and the clumsiness of drunks. His ability to observe and then exaggerate real behavior made his performances both hilarious and truthful. Slapstick, too, became his playground. Falling downstairs, being hit with pies, or stumbling into furniture were standard gags, but Charlie elevated them. He didn't just fall, he fell with character. A drunk man's stumble wasn't the same as a nervous man's trip. Every gag carried meaning. In 1910, Fred Karno's troupe embarked on a tour of the United States. For Charlie, this was both exhilarating and intimidating. He was only 21, still relatively inexperienced, but America was already the beating heart of entertainment. Vaudeville theaters lined the streets of New York, Chicago, and countless other cities, filled with audiences hungry for laughter. The troupe's performances were a success. American audiences responded to Charlie's mischievous charm with enthusiasm. His talent began to outshine even more established performers. Though he was just one of many in Karno's troupe, he was beginning to be noticed. The tour also introduced Charlie to the pace and scale of American show business. Theaters were larger, audiences more diverse, and competition fiercer than in London. But instead of being intimidated, Charlie was inspired. Somewhere inside, he began to sense that America might hold the key to his future. Even in these early years, Charlie's ambition burned brightly. He was never satisfied with being just another comic in the troupe. He wanted to be the best. He studied endlessly, refining every movement, every pause, every expression. He spent hours in front of mirrors, practicing walks, falls, and facial gestures until they were perfect. His colleagues often teased him for being too serious, too much of a perfectionist. But Charlie knew that comedy was serious business. It wasn't enough to be funny, he wanted to touch hearts, to make people feel something deeper than laughter. Looking back, it is clear that these years were the foundation of everything Charlie would later achieve. The boy who had once mimicked drunkards on the streets of London was now a rising star in the world of theatre. His skills in pantomime, slapstick, and character study were sharpening into tools he would soon wield on film. What he did not know yet was that across the ocean, in California, a new art form was emerging, one that would soon demand his talents. Motion pictures were still in their infancy, but within a few years, they would transform entertainment forever. And when they did, Charlie Chaplin would be ready. As the curtain fell on the Karno troupe's first American tour, Charlie returned to England with newfound confidence. He was no longer just a boy escaping poverty. He was a performer, an artist in the making. The hardships of his childhood had given him resilience, the stage had given him a voice. The next chapter of his life would carry him far from the music halls of London into the heart of Hollywood. The world would soon meet the little man with the bowler hat, baggy trousers, and cane. But before the Tramp could be born, Charlie had to finish this chapter of preparation, learning, observing, and dreaming of something greater. In 1910, Charlie Chaplin was only 21 years old, but he was already restless. His life in London had been a series of battles against poverty, hunger, and uncertainty. Yet, in the theatre, he had found his escape and his purpose. The stage gave him a place to transform pain into laughter, and with Fred Karno's troupe, he was beginning to shine. Still, a small voice inside told him that something greater awaited him. That voice grew louder as the troupe prepared for their first tour of the United States. For Charlie, setting foot in America was like stepping into another world. The bustling streets of New York City overwhelmed his senses. Bright lights, towering buildings, and the energy of thousands of people rushing in every direction, it was unlike anything he had ever seen. London was old, smoky, and grey. America was young, fast, and brimming with possibility. The troupe performed in vaudeville houses, and audiences greeted them with enthusiasm. Americans loved Karno's brand of slapstick comedy, and they especially loved Charlie. His boyish face, nimble movements, and expressive eyes made him stand out from the other performers. Even when he played minor roles, he had a way of commanding attention. But more than applause, America gave Charlie something else, a vision of opportunity. He could see that entertainment here wasn't just a pastime. It was an industry, a business that was growing at a pace he had never imagined. Vaudeville was thriving, but something newer and stranger was also beginning to rise: motion pictures. During his tours, Charlie sometimes wandered into Nickelodeons, the small theaters where silent films were shown for just a nickel. The films were short, often just comedies with clumsy chases, pies in the face, and exaggerated pratfalls. At first, he dismissed them. How could flickering pictures on a screen compare to the live laughter of an audience? But as he watched, something stirred in him. The actors didn't need words, they told stories with movement, with gestures, with expressions. It was pantomime, his art, brought to life on screen. Charlie didn't know it then, but those flickering images were the first sign of his destiny. After returning to England briefly, Chaplin joined Carnot's troupe again for a second American tour in 1912. By this time, he was one of their leading comedians, carrying much of the weight of their performances. His confidence had grown, and so had his ambition. One night, as the troupe performed in California, a representative from Keystone Studios attended the show. Keystone, run by Mack Sennett, was the leading comedy studio of the day, famous for its wild slapstick routines and the popular Keystone Cops. The representative was impressed by Chaplin's talent and recommended him to Sennett. For Charlie, this was the chance of a lifetime. Though hesitant at first, he agreed to a trial with Keystone in late 1913. The decision would change not only his life but the history of cinema itself. Charlie's first days at Keystone were not easy. Film acting was different from stage acting. On stage, he had the energy of a live audience to guide him. In film, there was silence, just a camera and a crew. At first, he struggled. His performances were too broad, too theatrical. The camera demanded subtlety, and he had to learn fast. But Charlie was a quick study. He began to adjust his movements, to let small expressions carry meaning. Soon, he realized that film offered something the stage never could: immortality. On film, his performance was captured forever. Then came the moment of genius. In early 1914, while working on a film, Charlie put together a costume almost by accident. He chose baggy pants, a tight coat, oversized shoes, a small bowler hat, and a cane. He added a toothbrush mustache to complete the look. When he walked onto the set in this outfit, something magical happened. He was no longer just Charlie Chaplin, he was the Tramp. The Tramp was everything audiences could love: poor but dignified, clumsy but clever, mischievous but kind-hearted. He was both funny and touching, a mirror of the struggles of ordinary people. For the rest of his career, the Tramp would define Chaplin and become one of the most iconic characters in cinema history. The Tramp's debut was electric. Audiences adored him from the first moment he stumbled onto the screen. They laughed at his antics, but they also felt sympathy for his struggles. Here was a comic character who wasn't just about pratfalls and pies in the face. He had heart. He had soul. Chaplin's rise at Keystone was meteoric. Within months, he was not just an actor but a star. And soon, he was demanding more control over his films, writing, directing, and shaping them according to his vision. His perfectionism sometimes irritated producers, but the results spoke for themselves. His films made money, and audiences couldn't get enough. By 1914, Charlie Chaplin was no longer just a boy from the workhouse. He was a film star in America, the land that had once seemed impossibly distant. His journey from poverty to fame had only just begun, but already he had discovered the power of film, the magic of the Tramp, and the possibility of shaping his destiny through art. The American dream was no longer just a dream, it was his reality. And with each step, he was rewriting the future of comedy and cinema. When Charlie Chaplin first donned the bowler hat, baggy trousers, oversized shoes, and small mustache, he could not have predicted the global sensation that was about to unfold. What began as a makeshift costume in 1914 soon grew into a cultural icon. Within a few short years, the Tramp was recognized from London to New York, from Paris to Tokyo. At Keystone Studios, Chaplin's early films were fast-paced, chaotic comedies filled with slapstick gags, wild chases, and custard pies. But Chaplin brought something different. He gave his character a soul. While others were content to fall downstairs for a laugh, Chaplin's Tramp had dignity, pathos, and charm. Audiences connected deeply with this. They saw themselves in the Tramp, struggling, clumsy, poor, but always hopeful. In a world marked by inequality, the First World War, and social upheaval, the Tramp was a symbol of resilience. Keystone quickly realized they had struck gold. Chaplin's films drew huge crowds, and his popularity skyrocketed. By 1915, less than a year after his debut, he was one of the most famous men in the world. But Chaplin was not satisfied with just acting. He wanted control. He wanted to shape the stories, direct the performances, and perfect the details. His perfectionism often caused delays, but he refused to compromise. In 1915, he left Keystone for S&A Studios, where he was granted more creative freedom and a significant pay raise. Here, he began to slow the frantic pace of slapstick and focus on character-driven comedy. His films grew longer, more thoughtful, and more emotional. With The Tramp, 1915, he fully introduced audiences to his signature character's world, the little vagabond wandering through life, facing hardship, but never losing hope. For the first time, comedy made people laugh and cry in the same breath. By 1916, Chaplin had moved to Mutual Film Corporation, signing one of the most lucrative contracts in Hollywood at the time. Mutual gave him unprecedented resources and time to make films. He produced masterpieces such as The Rink, The Pawn Shop, and Easy Street. These short films combined physical comedy with tender humanity. In Easy Street, 1917, Chaplin played a reformed criminal who becomes a policeman and must confront a neighborhood bully. The film was both hilarious and poignant, a mix that became Chaplin's signature. At Mutual, Chaplin's artistry blossomed. His films were no longer just entertainment, they were cultural events. Crowds lined up outside theaters, and newspapers covered his every move. He was now more than a star, he was a phenomenon. As the decade drew to a close, Chaplin made a bold move. Instead of another short comedy, he embarked on a feature-length film, The Kid, 1921, produced in 1919. This project would become one of his defining works. The Kid told the story of the tramp who finds an abandoned baby and raises him as his own. The film balanced comedy with heart-wrenching drama, showcasing Chaplin's ability to weave deep emotion into slapstick routines. Much of the film's tenderness was drawn from Chaplin's own life. He had known abandonment and poverty as a child, and he poured those experiences into his art. The relationship between the tramp and the child, played by Jackie Coogan, resonated deeply with audiences. When The Kid was finally released in 1921, it was an enormous success, cementing Chaplin as not just a comedian but one of the greatest storytellers of his time. Chaplin was not only an artist but also shrewd about business. By the late 1910s, he understood the power he held. He negotiated higher salaries, retained control over his films, and protected his creative independence fiercely. In 1919, along with fellow visionaries Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith, he co-founded United Artists, a distribution company that allowed filmmakers to control their own work. This move was revolutionary. It gave Chaplin the freedom to make the films he wanted without interference from studio heads. The creation of United Artists was a declaration of independence, both for Chaplin and for the artistic side of cinema. No longer would he be a hired performer, he was now his own master. While Chaplin was achieving personal and professional triumphs, the world was in turmoil. World War I had shaken nations and devastated millions of families. In Britain, some criticized Chaplin for not returning home to fight. But Chaplin defended his choice. He argued that he could serve the world better by bringing laughter during dark times. Indeed, his films provided much-needed relief to audiences struggling with war's devastation. Still, the criticism lingered, a reminder that fame always came with scrutiny. By the end of 1919, Charlie Chaplin was no longer just a rising star. He was one of the most powerful and influential figures in Hollywood. He had created a character beloved across the globe, redefined comedy as an art form, and gained control over his work in ways few others had managed. But perhaps most importantly, he had laid the foundation for his legacy. The Tramp was no longer just a character, he was a cultural symbol, representing the resilience of the human spirit. From the shadows of poverty in London to the heights of fame in Hollywood, Chaplin's journey had been extraordinary. Yet, this was only the beginning. The coming decades would bring some of his greatest triumphs, and his greatest challenges. By the 1920s, Charlie Chaplin had risen from a poor London boy to the most recognized face in the world. With United Artists established in 1919, Chaplin had both artistic freedom and financial independence. What followed was a golden era of filmmaking, during which Chaplin produced some of the most extraordinary works in cinema history. Released in 1921, The Kid marked Chaplin's first feature-length masterpiece. More than just a comedy, it was a tender exploration of love, poverty, and survival. The story followed the tramp who finds an abandoned baby and raises him as his own. Jackie Coogan, a 6-year-old with remarkable talent, played the child. Their bond on screen felt so authentic that audiences wept as often as they laughed. The film drew from Chaplin's own painful childhood. He had known hunger, abandonment, and the fear of losing loved ones. Through The Kid, he transformed personal wounds into art that resonated universally. When it premiered, critics hailed it as groundbreaking, and it became one of the most successful films of the silent era. In 1925, Chaplin released The Gold Rush, a film he described as the one he wanted to be remembered by. Set during the Klondike Gold Rush, the film showcased the tramp facing hunger and isolation in the snowy wilderness. One of its most famous scenes shows Chaplin cooking and eating his own boot, a sequence both hilarious and tragic. Another unforgettable moment comes when he imagines his boots turning into a roasted chicken as hunger drives him toward delirium. The Gold Rush was not only technically innovative but also emotionally rich. It captured the resilience of the human spirit during hardship, a theme audiences deeply connected with, especially in the aftermath of World War I. By 1928, Chaplin released The Circus, a story of the tramp mistakenly becoming a circus star. On screen, it was light-hearted and funny, but off-screen, Chaplin's life was filled with turmoil. During production, he was going through a messy divorce with his first wife, Mildred Harris, and faced tax problems and legal disputes. The stress was immense, yet he poured his energy into the film. In The Circus, the tramp falls in love with a circus rider, only to sacrifice his happiness so she can find love with another. The bittersweet ending reflected Chaplin's own sense of loneliness, despite his fame. The film was well received and later earned Chaplin a Special Academy Award for his contribution to cinema. By the early 1930s, talking pictures had taken over. Most silent film stars struggled to adapt, but Chaplin resisted the change. He believed the tramp's magic lay in silence, where pantomime and expression carried the story without the need for words. In 1931, he released City Lights, a silent film in an era dominated by sound. Many thought it would fail, but it became one of Chaplin's greatest triumphs. The film told the story of the tramp who falls in love with a blind flower girl and works tirelessly to help her regain her sight. The ending, where the girl, now cured, recognizes him not by his appearance but by his touch, remains one of the most moving moments in cinema history. Audiences adored City Lights. Albert Einstein attended its premiere, and critics praised it as Chaplin's masterpiece. It proved that silence still had power in a noisy world. In 1936, Chaplin released Modern Times, a biting satire of industrialization and the Great Depression. It was his final silent film, though it included some synchronized sound effects and music. The tramp, struggling to survive in a world dominated by machines, becomes a victim of factory life, unemployment, and social pressures. One of the most iconic scenes shows Chaplin caught inside giant gears, literally swallowed by the machinery of modern life. The film also marked the first appearance of Paulette Goddard, who became Chaplin's partner both on and off-screen for a time. Their chemistry gave the story warmth and optimism. Modern Times was Chaplin's commentary on a society losing its humanity to industrial progress. While critics debated its message, audiences embraced its humor and heart. The final scene, where the tramp and the girl walk into the unknown together, became a symbol of hope during dark times. Between 1920 and 1936, Chaplin solidified his place as one of the greatest artists of all time. He had taken silent comedy and elevated it into an art form that combined laughter, poetry, and social commentary. What set Chaplin apart was his ability to make audiences laugh while also touching their deepest emotions. His films spoke to the universal human experience: hunger, love, loss, resilience, and the search for dignity. By the mid-1930s, Chaplin was more than just a film star. He was a cultural icon whose work transcended borders, languages, and generations. The tramp had become a citizen of the world, loved in every country where a projector could cast his image on a screen. Yet, even as Chaplin reached artistic heights, the world was changing. Fascism was rising in Europe, political tensions were growing, and Hollywood was shifting toward new forms of entertainment. Chaplin sensed the storm approaching. The next chapter of his life would demand not just laughter, but courage. He would soon use his art to confront tyranny directly, risking his career and reputation in the process. By the late 1930s, Charlie Chaplin was the most recognized face in the world. The tramp had carried him from London's poverty to unimaginable fame and fortune. But Chaplin was never content to simply entertain. He wanted his art to say something, to challenge, to inspire, to provoke thought. That desire would lead to his greatest triumph, but also to his greatest troubles. In 1937, while most of Hollywood remained cautious about commenting on Adolf Hitler, Chaplin made a daring decision. He would use his art to ridicule fascism and expose its cruelty. The result was The Great Dictator, 1940, Chaplin's first full talking film. He played dual roles, a humble Jewish barber, and Adinard Hinkle, the dictator of Tamania, a thinly veiled parody of Hitler. The film combined slapstick humor with biting political satire. Audiences roared with laughter as Hinkle danced with a giant globe, imagining himself the ruler of the world. But beneath the comedy was a sharp critique of tyranny, prejudice, and war. The film culminated in a powerful speech, where Chaplin, as the barber mistaken for Hinkle, directly addressed the audience. He spoke not as a character but as a human being pleading for compassion, democracy, and unity. The words transcended cinema, they became a rallying cry for humanity. Though some critics found it too direct, audiences embraced it. Released a year before America entered World War II, The Great Dictator was Chaplin's boldest work. It proved that comedy could be a weapon against hate. But courage came at a cost. As the war raged, Chaplin's outspoken views and refusal to adopt U.S. citizenship made him a target for suspicion. Some accused him of being a communist sympathizer. Others attacked him for his criticism of capitalism and his calls for peace. In the 1940s, America was entering the Cold War era, and fear of communism ran deep. Chaplin's left-leaning sympathies, combined with his foreign origins, drew the ire of politicians, media, and even the FBI. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover began compiling a file on Chaplin, documenting his speeches, associations, and personal life. The beloved comedian who once united audiences was now being painted as a dangerous radical. While politics brought scrutiny, Chaplin's personal life added fuel to the fire. His relationships with much younger women, already controversial, led to damaging headlines. In the mid-1940s, he was embroiled in a scandal involving actress Joan Barry, who accused him of fathering her child. Though blood tests later proved he was not the father, the court case tarnished his reputation. The press painted him as immoral and predatory. The scandal, combined with political attacks, eroded much of the public's affection for him in America. Newspapers that once praised him now mocked him. What had been whispers of criticism became a roar of condemnation. In 1947, Chaplin released Monsieur Verdoux, a dark comedy about a man who marries and murders wealthy women to support his family. Inspired by real-life serial killers, the film shocked audiences. Chaplin defended it as a commentary on the hypocrisy of society. If a man kills one person, he said, he is a murderer. If he kills thousands in war, he is a hero. But audiences weren't ready for such cynicism, especially coming from the man who once made them laugh through innocence and tenderness. The film flopped in America, though it found appreciation in Europe. In the eyes of many, Chaplin had gone from beloved clown to controversial provocateur. The final blow came in 1952. Chaplin, then preparing to travel to London for the premiere of his film Limelight, was informed that his re-entry permit to the United States had been revoked. The U.S. government accused him of being a communist sympathizer and cited his scandals as evidence of his un-American character. Though never a member of the Communist Party, Chaplin had been outspoken about peace, criticized capitalism, and maintained friendships with leftist intellectuals, all of which were enough to brand him as suspicious in McCarthy-era America. Humiliated, Chaplin chose not to fight. He boarded a ship to Europe with his wife, Una O'Neill, daughter of playwright Eugene O'Neill, and their children. For the first time since he had arrived as a young man in 1910, he left America behind, this time, not to return for 2 decades. Chaplin settled in Corsia-sur-Vevey, Switzerland, where he purchased a grand estate overlooking Lake Geneva. Here, he found peace away from the noise of politics and scandal. With Una, he built a loving family, eventually raising 8 children. Though cut off from Hollywood, he continued to write and create. His film Limelight, 1952, though initially poorly received in America due to the political climate, became beloved in later years. It was a story of an aging clown who helps a young ballerina find her confidence, a tale that mirrored Chaplin's own struggles with fading glory and rejection. By the early 1950s, Chaplin was no longer the darling of Hollywood. He was a man in exile, admired in Europe but vilified in America. Yet, through it all, he remained true to himself. His courage to speak against tyranny in The Great Dictator, his willingness to challenge social norms in Monsieur Verdoux, and his refusal to bow to political pressure defined this era. Though controversial, Chaplin had proven that he was not just an entertainer but a fearless artist who used his platform to confront the most pressing issues of his time. For Chaplin, the cost was steep. His adopted country had turned its back on him. But in the long run, history would vindicate him. The world would remember him not for the scandals or accusations, but for his brilliance, his courage, and his unwavering belief in humanity. From 1937 to 1952, Chaplin transformed from a global entertainer into a political and cultural lightning rod. He had given the world one of its most powerful films in The Great Dictator, faced relentless attacks on his character, and endured forced exile from the land where he had built his career. Yet, rather than diminish him, these years deepened his legend. He was no longer just the tramp who made us laugh. He was the artist who dared to speak truth to power, even when it cost him everything. When Charlie Chaplin boarded the ship to Europe in 1952, leaving behind the United States where he had lived for more than 3 decades, it felt like the closing of one era and the uncertain beginning of another. For many in Hollywood, he was gone for good. Yet, exile did not silence Chaplin. It gave him space to reflect, to create in his own way, and to find a new rhythm in life. Chaplin and his wife Una O'Neill settled in a mansion called the Manoir de Ban in Corsia-sur-Vevey, Switzerland. Nestled against the Swiss Alps with a view of Lake Geneva, it was a place of serenity, far removed from the noise and hostility of Hollywood. Here, Chaplin transformed from a public figure constantly under scrutiny into a family man. With Una, he raised 8 children. His home was filled with laughter, music, and stories. For a man who had grown up in poverty and loneliness, this large, lively household was a dream fulfilled. Neighbors often saw Chaplin strolling the grounds, a cane in hand, smiling as his children played. He continued to write, read voraciously, and welcome guests from around the world. Though he had been exiled politically, he was embraced socially and culturally in Europe. Just as he was leaving America, Chaplin had completed Limelight, 1952. The film was autobiographical in tone, telling the story of Calvero, an aging clown who has lost his fame and struggles to find meaning in his later years. Through Calvero, Chaplin reflected on his own career, his fears of irrelevance, and the pain of being forgotten. The film was deeply personal, bittersweet, and filled with nostalgia. In one unforgettable scene, Chaplin performed on screen with his old contemporary and sometimes rival, Buster Keaton. Their collaboration, two giants of silent comedy sharing the stage, was both historic and moving. Although Limelight was well received abroad, it was largely ignored in America due to the political climate. Only decades later would it receive the recognition it deserved. In fact, when it was finally released in Los Angeles in the 1970s, it won Chaplin an Academy Award for Best Original Score, making it one of the longest gaps between a film's release and its Oscar recognition. In exile, Chaplin remained restless as an artist. In 1957, he released A King in New York, a satirical film about American politics, media, and paranoia. The story followed a deposed king who comes to America, only to encounter the absurdities of consumer culture and anti-communist hysteria. The film was sharp, critical, and bitterly funny. But it also revealed Chaplin's lingering anger toward the country that had rejected him. Predictably, it was banned in the United States for many years, though it was admired in Europe. This period showed a darker side of Chaplin's creativity. Gone was the wide-eyed innocence of the Tramp. In its place was a more cynical, reflective Chaplin, unafraid to confront the hypocrisies of the modern world. Despite the disappointments of political exile, Chaplin found joy in family life. His children adored him, and Una provided him with steady love and support. Una, who had been just 18 when she married the 54-year-old Chaplin, grew into her role as his partner and caregiver. The home in Switzerland became a gathering place for artists, intellectuals, and admirers. Chaplin entertained guests with music. He was a skilled violinist and pianist, and delighted in watching his children perform plays and skits. This quieter life allowed him to reflect on his extraordinary journey, from a childhood of hardship in London slums to global stardom, controversy, and exile. He began writing his autobiography, published in 1964, which became an international bestseller. In it, he shared his triumphs and failures with honesty, though some parts of his private life remained guarded. In the mid-1960s, Chaplin decided to direct one final major film, A Countess from Hong Kong, 1967. Unlike his earlier works, it starred big Hollywood names, Marlon Brando and Sophia Loren. Chaplin, now in his late 70s, hoped to recapture the magic of his earlier films, but the world of cinema had changed. Audiences found the film outdated, and critics dismissed it as a failure. For Chaplin, it was a disappointing finale to his filmmaking career. Yet even in failure, the film carried his unmistakable fingerprints, themes of love, dignity, and human connection. By the late 1960s, Chaplin's health began to decline. He suffered from strokes and grew increasingly frail. Yet, even as his body weakened, his legacy strengthened. Film historians, critics, and fans around the world began to re-evaluate his contributions. Festivals celebrated his films, retrospectives honored his artistry, and younger generations discovered his genius. The greatest moment of reconciliation came in 1972, when the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences invited Chaplin back to Hollywood to receive an honorary Oscar for his lifetime achievements. At first, Chaplin was hesitant. After all, it was America that had humiliated him, stripped his re-entry permit, and driven him away. But with Una's encouragement, he accepted. When he arrived in Los Angeles, frail and in a wheelchair, the reception was overwhelming. As he entered the stage at the Academy Awards, the audience gave him a 12-minute standing ovation, the longest in Oscar history. Tears filled Chaplin's eyes as decades of rejection were replaced with love and recognition. Holding his award, he said simply, "Words seem so futile, so feeble. I can only say thank you for the honor of inviting me here. You are wonderful, sweet people." After his triumphant return to Hollywood, Chaplin lived his remaining years quietly in Switzerland. He continued to write, listen to music, and enjoy time with his family. Though confined to a wheelchair in his last years, he never lost his sense of humor. Friends and children recalled how he still cracked jokes, hummed melodies, and watched the world with curious eyes. In 1975, Queen Elizabeth II knighted him, making him Sir Charles Chaplin. It was a final recognition of his place not just in cinema, but in cultural history. By 1972, when he returned to America, Chaplin's exile had spanned 2 decades. He had endured betrayal, misunderstanding, and distance from the country that had once adored him. Yet in exile, he had also found peace, a loving family, the serenity of Switzerland, and the chance to reflect on a life that had changed the face of cinema. He was no longer the lonely tramp, wandering the world in search of belonging. In his final years, he had found a home, not in any nation, but in the hearts of millions who cherished his work. By the 1970s, Charlie Chaplin had already lived several lifetimes within one. He had known poverty and hunger, unimaginable fame, bitter scandal, exile, and triumphant recognition. Now, in his twilight years, he was no longer the energetic performer who once leaped across the silver screen. Instead, he was a man of quiet reflection, surrounded by family and the comfort of a peaceful Swiss estate. After his emotional return to Hollywood in 1972 for the honorary Oscar, Chaplin seemed at peace. The 12-minute standing ovation he received was not just applause, it was redemption. For decades, he had been misunderstood, even vilified, yet the audience's thunderous love reminded him that his art had endured. At his home in Switzerland, Chaplin's days took on a slower rhythm. He spent mornings reading, afternoons listening to classical music, and evenings with his wife, Una, and their children. Sometimes, he would sit by the window overlooking Lake Geneva, his thoughts wandering through the decades of his extraordinary journey. But age and illness began to weigh on him. Strokes left him frail and confined to a wheelchair. His once agile body, which had dazzled audiences with balletic pratfalls and physical comedy, no longer obeyed him. Yet, even as his body failed, his mind remained sharp, filled with wit, memories, and the spark of curiosity that had defined him since boyhood. In 1975, Chaplin received another honor that brought him immense pride. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II, becoming Sir Charles Spencer Chaplin. The ceremony at Buckingham Palace was brief, but deeply symbolic. For the boy who had grown up in the slums of London, often hungry and destitute, to now kneel before the monarch and rise as a knight was a testament to his remarkable journey. The British press, which had once looked at Chaplin with suspicion for abandoning England for Hollywood, now celebrated him as a national treasure. The honor reaffirmed that his contributions belonged not just to cinema, but to the cultural heritage of the world. In these final years, family was Chaplin's greatest joy. His children remembered him not just as the genius of film, but as a loving father who encouraged their creativity and playfulness. The house in Corsia-sur-Vivi was often filled with laughter, music, and visitors from around the globe who wanted to pay respects to the great artist. Una, his wife of more than 2 decades, became his steadfast caregiver. Devoted, gentle, and protective, she shielded him from the outside world when he grew too weak for public appearances. Chaplin often said that Una was his anchor, the love that had given him stability after years of turbulence. By 1977, Chaplin's health had sharply declined. He was bedridden, his once lively eyes dimmed but still holding traces of humor. That December, as his family gathered around him for Christmas, he seemed content, even if weakened by illness. In the early hours of December 25, 1977, Charlie Chaplin passed away in his sleep at the age of 88. The world awoke on Christmas morning to the news that the greatest comedian of the silent era was gone. The irony was not lost on anyone. The man who had spent his life bringing joy and laughter had departed on the day celebrated for joy and hope. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. Newspapers declared that an era had ended. Fellow filmmakers, actors, and artists mourned his passing, while ordinary people felt as though they had lost a friend. In Hollywood, where he had once been exiled, his legacy was celebrated with reverence. Film festivals screened his classics. Critics revisited his artistry, recognizing him not just as a comedian but as one of cinema's greatest poets. The Tramp, his beloved character, became immortal in death, forever walking, cane in hand, into the horizon. Yet Chaplin's story did not end with his death. In a bizarre twist worthy of one of his films, his coffin was stolen from its grave in Corsia-sur-Vevey just months after his burial. Two men attempted to extort Una Chaplin, demanding ransom money for the return of her husband's body. The scheme shocked the world, turning the quiet Swiss countryside into the scene of a macabre crime. But Una, displaying the same resilience her husband had embodied, refused to be intimidated. "Charlie would have thought it rather ridiculous," she remarked. After a police investigation, the thieves were caught, and Chaplin's coffin was recovered. To prevent further incidents, his body was reburied in a concrete grave, where it rests to this day. Chaplin's death closed one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of cinema. From a childhood of poverty to global superstardom, from the laughter of millions to exile and redemption, his life had been a drama as compelling as any film. In his last years, he had found peace. Surrounded by the love of his family, honored by the world, and remembered for his art, he left behind not just films, but a legacy of laughter, resilience, and hope. The Tramp's final walk had ended. But his image, bowler hat, cane, oversized shoes, remained etched in the collective memory of humanity. Chaplin had once said that life is a tragedy when seen in close-up, but a comedy in long shot. In the long shot of history, his life was both tragic, comic, and profoundly beautiful. When Charlie Chaplin passed away on Christmas Day, 1977, many feared that an era had ended and that his art might fade with time. But the truth was quite the opposite. In death, Chaplin's presence became even larger, his influence spreading beyond the confines of cinema into literature, politics, philosophy, and popular culture. The Tramp walked on, not just across screens, but across the imagination of humanity. The days and weeks following his death were filled with global tributes. Newspapers described him as the poet of laughter and the clown of humanity. Heads of state sent condolences, artists shared memories, and ordinary citizens wrote letters expressing how much Chaplin had meant to them. In London, where his childhood had been one of hunger and neglect, theatres screened The Kid and City Lights to packed audiences. In New York, critics revisited The Great Dictator, marveling at its prophetic power. And in small towns around the world, people who had grown up watching him in silent cinemas passed his films down to their children, ensuring the laughter continued. Perhaps what is most remarkable is how Chaplin's messages remain urgent. His critique of industrialization in modern times resonates in an era of automation. His plea for humanity in The Great Dictator feels timeless in the face of political conflicts. His reminder to look for beauty in hardship in City Lights and The Kid continues to comfort generations. Even in the digital age of smartphones and CGI, where films are more technologically advanced than ever, Chaplin's silent films remind us that the core of storytelling is empathy, humor, and truth.